Okay, good evening and welcome to all of you, and welcome to the 16th Indian Economic and Social History Review Lecture. As you know, this is a lecture now in the last few years, which we have always been holding in September. Previously, we used to hold it later in the year, but we've more or less settled on dates in September now. Before I introduce our speaker for this evening, as some of you may remember, we instituted an article prize 2 years ago for the best article published in the preceding year in the journal. And the first prize was awarded last year. This is a prize which is awarded in memory of our former editor, the late Professor Sunil Kumar of the University of Delhi. So for this year, I'm going to request one of the managing editors, Professor Tirthankar Roy, to come and do the honors in regard to this prize.
Well, this is always a very pleasant task. I represent here the editorial board, but also the jury that selected, read about 16 odd articles published during the year, and then selected one for the prize. I have to say that it was quite a tough decision. And we had needed to discuss this in several rounds. At the end of it, we selected an article that was published in January, the first issue of 2024. The article is called Caste, Food and Colonialism, Outcast Domestics in the European Houses of Madras Presidency. And the author, who is sitting in the front row, is Dr. S. Gunasekaran. If you could come up here. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm not giving this to you yet because I have to read out the citation. So here is what the jury, how they framed the reason for giving this prize. Gunasekaran's essay links the history of work in colonial European homes with caste dynamics in colonial Madras. He shows how upper caste resistance to working in the kitchens of beef-eating colonial masters opened opportunities for lower castes to enter these homes. Kitchens became sites of cultural exchange. Pariah cooks and butlers absorbed English tastes, etiquettes, and language, while Mem Sahibs adopted Pariah cuisine into recipes, cookbooks, and European kitchens. The relationship between Pariah women and Mem Sahibs were layered, marked by intimacy, loyalty, and friendship, yet also tension and anxiety. For pariahs, these encounters brought new opportunities of employment, mobility, self-confidence, and the capacity to question entrenched upper caste hegemony. Imaginatively conceived and richly textured, the essay is a pleasure to read. That was our unanimous decision in the end. At this point, I will hand this over to you because you have earned it.
Thank you so much.
And not. Just in case you are mistaken to think that this is the only gift from us, it isn't. And there's also a cash prize that comes with it. Okay.
So here we go. So when I'm done introducing you, move back there. Right? Okay. It gives me great pleasure to introduce David Atwill, but before I do that, let me remind you all to turn your telephones to silent mode. or turn them off. Professor David Atwill, who it's our pleasure to host today, is Professor of History and Dean of Arts and Sciences in NYU Shanghai, NYU's campus in Shanghai. He was educated in the United States in Wheaton College and subsequently in the University of Hawaii, where he did his PhD. He then went on to teach for an extended period of time in Pennsylvania State University before he assumed the current position that he holds in NYU Shanghai. He is a specialist of, in particular, 19th century Chinese history. His first book was entitled The Chinese Sultanate, published in 2005 by Stanford University Press. It's a book which deals with the turbulent period in the history of Yunnan, the bordering province, so the sort of southwestern China abutting on Burma, and in fact not that far from eastern India. This book has now been reissued in a more recent paperback edition by Verso Press in London under a slightly different title of the Pantai Rebellion. He then went on to work on another aspect of Islam in the Chinese world, the larger Chinese world. It's a book which then came out in 2018 called Islamic Shangri-La, which concerns in particular the Muslim communities of Lhasa, a subject which a few people have worked on, but which remained quite neglected until he dealt with it. In addition to that, of course, he has a large number of articles, some edited volumes, and so on. And today he'll be talking to us, and has given us as his topic, Convenient Lies and Inconvenient Truths, Chinese Cosmopolitanism, British Legalized Lawlessness, and the Demythification of Commissioner Li Zexu in the Opium War. So welcome, David, and we look forward to hearing you.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. I first want to thank you can hear me? Oh, okay, there we go. Okay. I just wanted to start off by thanking initially Jyoti Balachandran, who was a former colleague of mine at Penn State University, was supposed to do the introductions, but has fell ill tonight. So Sanjay nicely stepped in. So thank you very much for that introduction. But I also want to thank the entire editorial team for the gracious invitation and for hosting me here during my time in Delhi. It is really a pleasure for me to give this talk. When I've written the book that this material comes from, one of my guiding principles was I wanted to write a book that was really meant for a more public-facing audience. And so it's precisely audiences like this that I really relish the opportunity to talk to, and especially when I know that you could be doing many other things on a Friday evening and that you've tried to get through all of the Delhi traffic to come here. So I take it as a real honor to be able to, and a privilege to give this talk to you tonight. I want to start off by just kind of contextualizing the talk in the sense that if you read the, make sure this is there, the description that we see for millennia, Chinese commodities, culture, and philosophical thought shaped the world around it. And the historical record is very clear on those Europeans who came to China, Marco Polo, Matteo Ricci, and others. All of these people wrote on China in very gracious and positive terms. Conversely, numerous Chinese voyaged in the opposite direction, across Asia and beyond, and visiting these places and sharing their knowledge and learning from those places and coming back. People like Xuanzang, Zheng He, Fa Xian, and Jiang Qian. As a result of this engagement, in the pre-modern world, China was often seen to define what it meant to be cultured, cosmopolitan, and urbane. In most popular accounts, this positive attitude changes on a very specific date in the past. On a spring day in 1839, when Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu arrived in the city of Guangzhou in southern China, and there demanded that nearly 3 million pounds of British opium be handed over and destroyed. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that in the decades and centuries since, no single event has loomed larger in Asian history than the Opium War. It is included in almost every survey of world history, and it seems that every year or two there's a new book on opium usage or the Opium War itself. More recently, several best-selling works of fiction have also drawn on the event itself. I'm thinking here of R.F. Huang's Babel, Amtiv Ghosh's brilliant IESHR trilogy, more recently his non-fiction work, Smoke and Ashes. So the Opium War is one event of the 19th century that almost every student of history can identify and remember. But centering on the Opium War has come at a cost. It privileges an externalist narrative that promotes unambiguously a British perspective. It is this broader narrative of the Opium War, set as the dramatic climax in China's explicit and often described as foolhardy refusal to engage, adapt, or accept the West, that is the focus of my lecture tonight. And this evening I want to offer a retelling that seeks to highlight the flawed manner that Asia's past is often told. A version where Britain's actions remain timelessly progressive, worldly, and modern. Critically, my version, I want to overturn this standard narrative. I want to overturn and understand why China has been portrayed as backward, intolerant, and uninterested in the world around it. By giving voice to the Chinese side of this historical narrative, it doesn't alter the outcomes, but it allows us to include indigenous voices, to explore the Chinese imperial responses, and highlight how racism, prejudice, and war has shaped the global power dynamics of that era. By the archives, equally I seek to emphasize these are not blanks that were previously undiscovered. These are based on documents in the archives and historical records, and I want to highlight that such omissions were essentially inconvenient truths, and their removal have just been convenient lies that allowed us to perpetuate the British imperialist impulses and liberal imperialist underpinnings that justified such actions. Biases that I would argue linger in our telling today. So over the next hour or so, I want to follow the standard British-centric narrative to hopscotch across 19th century Asia. In essence, I want to divide this talk up into 3 acts. In the first act, we're going to begin in the 18th century, providing some background, but focusing on the McCartney mission, something that maybe I would subtitle A Problem of Their Own Making. In Act 2, I want to move on then to Lin Zexu himself and the Opium War, something Act 2 we might subtitle as An Old Tale Retold. And then in the final section, Act 3, we will conclude with the so-called Second Opium War, a war that actually has nothing to do with opium, but culminates in the burning of the Yuan Summer Palace. Maybe that we could subtitle English Lessons Poorly Taught. To tell this history, let me begin in the late 18th century. to start with events and institutions that are indisputable signs of early modern globalism, but also the roots of a British worldview that would culminate in Britain's more violent enforcement of its one-sided version of commercial, political, and cultural correctness. By the mid-18th century, Britain's and Europe's engagement with China came increasingly not by way of Beijing in the north, but through a single Chinese city, Guangzhou, sometimes known as Canton, in southern China. The rise of Guangzhou in the 1700s occurred primarily as a result of the so-called Canton system. In the first 75 years of its existence, the Canton system worked well. The controls created a high demand, high profit scenario for all involved. The Canton system channeled all European maritime trade in and out of this single southern Chinese port. It was praised by both foreign traders and Chinese merchants alike. This system allowed the Qing government an easy way to control foreign trade, impose taxes, and supervise domestic merchants. Often cast as an anti-free trade mechanism created by the Qing court to limit the scale of Chinese international trade, Qing rules and regulations did actually not seek to restrict the size of the quantity of foreign trade. Rather, the imperial court simply sought to shape the nature and scope of that trade. In an era of a dramatically increasing international maritime trade, the Qing strategy reflected a global tendency of many governments around the world to promote and enforce monopolistic trade practices in order to better leverage their position in a competitive trade environment. In Europe, as many of us know, this manifested itself slightly differently. European governments tended to issue governmental charters to private trading companies as a monopoly. In this way, by limiting trade along a specific route, usually for specific commodities, to a single company, a government's ability to tax and control high-demand goods was greatly enhanced. In Britain, as we all know, the British East India Company had the sole authority to trade with Asia. Other European governments also followed this path, such as the Dutch, the Swedish, and Portuguese, all granting similar monopolies. It was with a slightly different reasoning the Qing government achieved a comparable result by limiting trade not to a single company, but to a single port. In this manner, China facilitated the regulating and taxing of trade without requiring the government to be concerned with the day-to-day running of such trade, and it flourished. But despite its virtues, British commercial interests by the late 1700s began to chafe under the perceived limitations that such an arrangement placed on them. As a result, British East India officials, politicians, and traders criticized China primarily on culture rather than commercial, political, or social grounds. That is to say that the Canton system is characterized by the British and more Anglophone histories today as a sign that China sought to isolate itself, that it was a sign of China's cultural arrogance, that it reflected the Qing Empire's ignorance of the ways that the modern states should function. In 1792, King George III decided to resolve this matter diplomatically by selecting George Macartney to lead a mission. The mission had two objectives: that the British be granted a permanent embassy in Beijing, and that other ports beyond Guangzhou be open to British trade. When viewed from the perspective of British commercial exigencies of the era, the mission's objectives seemed appropriate, opportune, and essential. George Macartney himself had many qualities, but experience in China was not one of them. Certain that Britain's wealth, advanced scientific discoveries, and innumerable commercial opportunities would carry the day, McCartney spared no expense or effort in acquiring a copious number of items to both amaze the Chinese with Britain's scientific advances. He packed an enormous planetarium, clocks, muskets, a diving bell, and even a hot air balloon. Equally, McCartney sought to entice the Chinese court with commercial potential of expanded trade relations. To this end, McCartney spent the greater part of his funds on textiles, first-rate British-produced broadcloth, woolens, and cottons. Confident in the quality and number of the gifts they had procured, comforted by the thought that he had acquired a Chinese translator, albeit one who could not speak English and only could speak Italian and Latin, and with the final authorization by the Qing government to proceed to the capital, the embassy finally sailed north to Tianjin, the port closest to Beijing, arriving in 1793. But things did not go as planned. When the embassy arrived in Beijing and later escorted north to the emperor's summer palace at Ruihe, McCartney and the other British dignitaries made a shocking discovery. In the gardens and palaces of Beijing and Ruihe, the embassy found a plethora of spheres, orreries, clocks, and musical automata that were far finer than the gifts that they had brought. George McCartney had vastly overestimated China's isolation, badly misjudged Chinese tastes, and completely miscalculated Qing's awareness and possession of European goods, scientific devices, and intellectual advances. Now, this is precisely where the standard histories pull a kind of sleight of hand. Instead of describing China's wealth, sophistication, and cosmopolitanism, we encounter a set of public-facing accounts that attempt to blame the failure of the mission on China's massive arrogance. Typically, one of two, or sometimes both examples, are given as evidence to prove this. The first is the claim that in the audience with the Qing emperor, McCartney refused to debase himself by prostrating himself or performing the kowtow by touching his head to the ground. The second was the assertion that the Qianlong's letter to the King George was arrogant and conceited missive, both demeaning and vain. But both of these excuses for the McCartney mission's failure misdirect our understanding of McCartney's mistakes. The Qing court records demonstrate that the Qianlong emperor did not even remark on McCartney's method of prostration, and that the letter from the Qianlong to King George responded to the British demands one by one, politely rejecting each of their requests. China would not allow a permanent diplomatic mission in Beijing, nor would they expand trade for the British to other Chinese ports. In this detailed and considerate and lengthy response, the emperor explained that the Qing court's, quote, sole aim is to do its utmost to achieve good government, and concluded with perhaps the most famous quoted line and most quoted line of the missive, quote, consequently, there is nothing we lack. As your principal envoy and others have themselves observed, we have never set much store on the strange or ingenious objects, nor do we need any more of your country's manufactures. Which is to say, despite the lengthy half-lives in Anglophone accounts, both of these hoary explanations have been refuted by many scholars, most recently and most eloquently by Henrietta Harrison in her work, The Perils of Interpreting. So to transform either of these two elements given above as some sort of Rosetta Stone that allows the modern reader to unlock the mission's reception is to miss the mission's impact and legacy entirely. Absent from most accounts is just how familiar the Qing court was, courtesy of the Jesuit presence in Beijing's court, was with European technology, science, and innovations. Even less remarked upon was how aware they were of Britain's actions and rise in Asia and their possible impact on China. Throughout McCartney's visit, Qing officials repeatedly demonstrated to the members of their mission their awareness of the shifting geopolitical threats around them. They posed questions to Macartney and other members of the embassy about Britain's imperial ambitions, asked about Russia's military abilities, even going as far as demonstrating their knowledge of Macartney's own appointment to Russia as ambassador to Catherine the Great, and pressing upon him to offer them and share his impressions of Russia's stature in Europe. Understood from this perspective, far from being naive or overconfident, Qianlong was in fact concerned with what he understood about Britain's growing stature, and that what effect his rejection of Britain might result in their refusal to leave Chinese waters, or worse, perhaps wreak havoc with their 64-gun warship. Qianlong's frame of mind soon after Macartney's departure from Beijing is visible in his communication with officials that were posted along the southeastern seaboard, when he alerted them and warned them, England is stronger and fiercer than other countries in the Western Ocean. Since things have not gone according to their wishes, it may cause them to stir up trouble. Qianlong's dismissal of Macartney in 1793 was not some misplaced cultural arrogance, quite the reverse. Qing China saw the British for what they were, a powerful competitor on the horizon, intent on vanquishing all who lay in their path. So how did this British-centric narrative form? As often the case, indeed what seems to be the core pillar of President Trump's foreign policy today, the best defense is a good offense, and facts should never get in the way of making failure seem anything less than success. Namely, the members of the British mission, upon returning to Great Britain, adopted a racially infused language of civilizing mission, portraying the Chinese actions as crass, ignorant, and unaware of their own shortcomings. Upon their return to Britain, they offered embellished narratives of the mission, very quickly beginning to cast the British failure as entirely due to the Qing court's boorish, disrespectful, and rude behavior. Macartney's valet in personal service, Aeneas Anderson, the year after they returned, published a widely read version of events, insisting, quote, the manner in which the ambassador was dismissed from Beijing was ungracious and mortifying in the extreme. And he concluded, in short, we entered Beijing like paupers, we remained in it like prisoners, and we quitted it like vagrants. Another of Macartney's staff, John Barrow, who served as Macartney's main secretary, described China as, quote, worn out with old age and disease, and due to a spirit of pride and self-importance, as well as jealousy, rejects and expels foreigners. Yet despite the public dissemination of such characterizations and repeated use of them in subsequent historical accounts, these do not align with other contemporary accounts by either the Qing court or other British members of the mission. Indeed, entirely absent from these accounts is the fact that the Qing reception of the embassy had been nothing but gracious, appropriate, and befitting, as we can see from this image to my left. My point in laying out this earlier history is to show that although the British in this instance had not resorted to force, Qianlong Emperor and the Qing dynasty were already aware that violence was intrinsic to the way that the British wielded their colonial authority. More than just aware, they were guarded, suspicious, and circumspect. Attitudes that have all been deliberately portrayed as isolated, arrogant, and unworldly. Yet the Macartney mission and Qianlong's comments hint at a far bigger problem, a problem that had little to do with China's willingness or unwillingness to allow British traders into other Chinese ports or to have a permanent embassy in Beijing. There's little doubt that the cause of both China's and Britain's concern with Guangzhou's international trade came not from the structural framework in which the trade occurred, rather it stemmed from the inability to control supply and demand of two key items, tea and opium. This is just a picture of the summer palace in Beijing that had Jesuit influences. And so you can see for your own eyes that George McCartney must have had quite a shock when he arrived here, realizing that he had been outdone by the Chinese themselves. Let me begin with tea. No single factor shaped Chinese and British early relations more than Britain's seemingly insatiable thirst for Chinese tea. It was an appetite China had happily fed since Britain first began to import tea in the 17th century. Although the demand for Chinese tea had steadily increased across the 18th century, it did so in a manner that had generally benefited all involved. The relationship, however, took on a new and increasingly unsustainable character in 1784, when the British Parliament passed the Commutation Act. Until this point, the British government's monopoly in the tea trade functioned well. From a business perspective, the British tea traders' ability to control the supply of tea into Britain greatly enhanced their ability to maintain the domestic price of tea, and thus their profits. From the standpoint of the British government, the monopoly offered a mechanism by which it could lucratively tax all tea imports, a tax that by 1784 often more than doubled the price of tea for local consumers. The tax did have one unfortunate side effect: tea smuggling. Many of Britain's neighbors also imported Chinese tea, but taxed it at a lower rate. As a result, this highly sought-after beverage was available in many of Britain's European neighbors at a considerably lower price, which in turn fueled a rise in tea smuggling all along Britain's coasts. British politicians began to realize that the profits gained from such a high tax were considerably diminished by the expenses associated with anti-smuggling enforcement, not to mention the public's displeasure over the high cost of tea. So in 1784, in a single stroke, the Commutation Act reduced the tax from 119% to 12.5%. The act was an overwhelming success. Deprived of illicit profits, the bulk of tea imports returned to legal channels, thus boosting the government's ability to both collect the full tax and ended anti-smuggling efforts. The common consumer also benefited from the reduced tax rate, resulting in the price of tea tumbling to new lows. With tea now available at a much lower price, tea consumption in Britain surged. Over the next 4 decades, it is estimated that the per capita consumption of tea in Britain and Britain's colonies increased 5-fold. None of this was unanticipated. The British tea merchants, who stood to gain the most by the lowered taxes, reduced prices, and increased consumption, were fully prepared to meet this new demand and happily made a tidy profit in the process. With their monopoly once again firmly under their control, the British East India Company's annual profits rose to nearly 3 million British pounds by the early 1830s. The rise of tea consumption only failed in a single respect. Britain, having created massive domestic demand for tea, was faced with an unsavory dilemma. Either find a way to produce tea themselves in India and reduce their exports from China, or to find a way to increase British imports to China that would offset their ever-increasing British demand for Chinese tea. The primary problem with the supply end of that equation for Britain was that few other places in the world outside of China could provide tea in the quantity and quality they desired. The unprecedented rise in demand for Chinese tea was not offset by a correspondingly exuberant enthusiasm for British goods in China. The result, thus, was an untenable trade deficit for Britain. As many of you know, tea today does grow in India, but it was not until the early 1820s that the British discovered tea growing within their own colonial boundaries in northeastern India. After this discovery, it took another 60 years to domesticate, establish their own tea plantations, and perfect its processing. Only in 1887 did the tea production in British India ultimately surpass 50% of the total amount of tea imported to Britain. This was of little use to the British in the late 1700s and early 1800s, as Britain's trade deficit continued to grow. Britain's only solution was to find a product that China would buy in sufficient quantities to offset the trade imbalance. Within just a few years of passing the 1784 Commutation Act, Britain discovered just such an alternative: opium. The British began growing opium in British India in the early 18th century. State-licensed farms grew opium poppies that would be sold for a set price to the government. The government, in turn, would process the raw opium and sell it at auction to private merchants to trade illicitly to China. By 1797, the system was declared a state monopoly by the British East India Company, who then commissioned, managed, and administered its production under the Opium Department, a system that would remain in place until 1947. Although entirely an Indian operation, it was through an efficient restriction of domestic sales in India that opium addiction among Indians remained relatively low. The production and sale of opium to China quickly became a major revenue stream for British India. Within a decade, it had already begun to reverse the trade deficit with China. From the British perspective, opium neatly resolved the economic dilemma caused by their own unbridled affinity for tea, and it had begun to subsidize the cost of running the colonial government in India. As you all might expect, China's reaction to Britain's opium solution was not quite as favorable. As India's opium trade to China grew at a rapid rate across the early decades of the 19th century, the Qing government became increasingly troubled by the outflow of silver and the growing number of Chinese opium addicts. By 1839, the Qianlong Emperor's grandson, the Daguang Emperor, had decided that the time had come to end this illegal trade and had selected the ideal candidate to end it, Lin Zexu. Commissioner Lin arrived in Guangzhou on March 10, 1839. It had taken Lin 60 days to travel south from Beijing to Guangzhou. After leaving the imperial capital, he proceeded overland by sedan chair until he reached the Yangtze River. The remainder of his trip was made by boat through an interconnected network of rivers and inland waterways. Arriving in Guangzhou in mid-March in 1839, he made his way across a gangplank to the wharf. His movements conveyed an easy, quiet confidence, derived from several decades of service. Portly, round-faced, and with a well-trimmed, wispy goatee, Lin appeared amiable, if somewhat difficult to read. Dressed in a full, dark-length gown, an elegant beaded necklace, and a round hat topped by a bright red glass ball and tassel, Lin fit the part as a high-ranked Chinese mandarin. By this point, he was known to possess a quick intellect. He had proven himself a gifted administrator. At just 53 years of age, he had risen through the infamously competitive bureaucracy. He was well-connected, administratively savvy, and at the height of his administrative powers. Still, the enormity of the emperor's orders weighed on him. Cure the Chinese empire of its opium problem. Now, the British officials in Guangzhou quickly developed quite a different impression of Lin. From the moment Lin had stepped foot in Guangzhou, the British representative, Charles Eliot, also pictured here, had worked to paint his actions and intentions as a malevolent instrument of a despotic regime. In one of his earliest dispatches to Britain's Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, Eliot described Lin as, quote, a rash man hastening in on a career of violence, and predicted that under Lin's leadership, China was inflicting, quote, amongst the most shameless violences which one nation has ever dared to perpetuate against another. Now, this, of course, ignored entirely the single issue for which Lin had been sent to Guangzhou. The British were committing a criminal act by trading in an illicit drug. As Lin pressed for the British to sign a pledge to bring the opium trade to an end, Eliot time and again denied, rebuffed, and defied any such request. In a letter to Palmerston, Eliot boasted, and in one instance, he, quote, tore up at once Lin's draft version of the pledge and claimed it was useless for Lin and other imperial officials to, quote, trouble themselves for me or any other upon the subject of this bond. Lin's actions were transparent and focused on a single goal. He needed to eliminate the opium. With the British refusing to cooperate, Lin had only one course of action. He decided to blockade the British in their own factories, their own warehouses. When Lin did impose the blockade on the foreigners in their factory 2 weeks after his arrival, a step he took with great reluctance, Charles Eliot played the victim, calling the blockade unprovoked, unwarranted, and indefensible. In Eliot's telling, Lin's restrictions became an institution of intimidatory proceedings, forcible detentions, and menaced privation. This description was not only overwrought and far-fetched, it was almost certainly untrue if we compare it with other first-hand accounts. British trader William Hunter offered one of the few day-by-day accounts of this period in Guangzhou, noted that the foreigners under the blockade were, quote, so idle we met in the square every afternoon and had all sorts of games, balls, leapfrogs, etc., much to the amusement of the Chinese. A British naval surgeon who treated the British after their release wrote that the foreigners held in the factories reported, quote, they were never better fed, treated in the most kindest and most indulgent manner. Another witness suggested that the gravest threat the British faced was from an absence of exercise and overfeeding than from any actual want of necessities of life. Yet it was the blockade that would become the rallying cry of the British government, who declared that such treatment resulted in, quote, glaring insults and grievous wrongs being committed by the Chinese upon our flag and against the Queen's subjects. In the few instances that the British acknowledged China's ban on the opium, all blame remained squarely on the Chinese. One common refrain repeated by Eliot repeatedly in a report to Lord Palmerston was that it was a memorial to the emperor proposing that opium be legalized nearly 2 years earlier in 1837 had caused, quote, the most conceivable encouragement for Britain to assume opium would become legal. Eliot went on to plead that such a confusion left opium's status as an illegal commodity as, quote, a matter of perfect doubt, right up to the very day Lin's first notices appeared outlying or trying to eradicate opium. Eliot's claims were both mendacious and contradicted Britain's clear knowledge of the Qing court's actions. Eliot's disingenuous attempts to emphasize China's uneven enforcement of their own laws conveniently downplayed Britain's undeniable and leading role in the production, transfer, and perpetuation of the opium trade. A trade Eliot even referred to in his correspondence with Palmerston as, quote, our opium. Britain's position in the opium trade with China was never in question. By 1839, British India's production of opium, the opium trade's year-on-year growth, and the elaborate distribution network of millions of pounds of opium to China was deliberate, targeted, and highly developed. Also not in question was opium's status in China as an illicit product. Lin repeatedly hammered home this fact to the British, and which the British rarely disputed. Indeed, Eliot, at one point, agrees that it's beyond dispute, then, that those who will come to Guangzhou to trade must act in obedience to Chinese laws. However, the British stymied Lin's efforts to end the trade in many other ways. Eliot insisted Lin's efforts to make each trader sign bonds agreeing to cease trade in opium to China were, quote, incompatible with the laws of England and an egregious infraction on their rights. Using China's invocation of the death penalty for those people who tried to import opium as their sole pretext not to agree with the law, Elliot and the remaining 15 foreign traders refused to agree to such a pledge. They continued to assert that the hypothetical death of a British captain ignorant on the matters of law, of China's laws, and who maybe sailed into Canton, mattered more than their perpetuation of a trade that killed millions of Chinese each year. Well, Lin had no choice but acquiesce to Elliot's and the other 14 officials' refusal. He only allowed them to depart to Macau after they signed a statement agreeing never again to return to this empire. If the British defiance of China's laws regarding the importation of opium tested Lin's forbearance, the July 7th killing of a Chinese villager by British sailors pushed him to his limit. The incident, even as reported to by the British, was straightforward. In one contemporary account, American Samuel Wells Williams described the event as transpiring when, quote, in the early part of July, a party of sailors were on shore and became ungovernable from the liquor they had taken. And in the excitement of the moment, they set upon the Chinese around them, and killed a man, besides nearly demolishing a small temple. The British never contested these facts. Indeed, Charles Elliot, immediately upon hearing about the death, traveled to the site, investigated the matter, and promptly compensated the Chinese family with $2,000, a considerable sum at the time. Lin, however, given that a Chinese subject had been killed on Chinese soil, demanded that the British hand over the guilty party to be tried in a Chinese court. Elliot refused. In a patently circular argument, Elliot claimed that since 6 British sailors were involved in the incident, it was impossible to identify who had landed the death blow. As such, Elliot dismissed Lin's demand as unreasonable and refused to cooperate with his investigation. In face of Elliot's repeated disregard for Chinese sovereignty and law, Lin's patience began to grow thin. His lengthy response taunted Elliot with only loosely veiled disdain. Lin asked how, if Elliot had gone to the scene of the crime twice since the incident happened and had spent days investigating the matter, how could he still be unclear who the murderer was? Lin, in his response to Elliot, openly and personally challenged Elliot's actions. For the first time, he said, how could Elliot even call himself an official, and suggested to all outward appearances Elliot was nothing more than a know-nothing wooden puppet. Charles Elliot remained unmoved. Rather than agree to hand over the group of sailors to Lin, Elliot held a trial on board a British vessel whereby 5 of the 6 sailors were found guilty of riot and assault, given fines and prison sentences. But even Elliot admitted that such a decision took him, quote, to the very utmost verge of his powers and probably exceeded them. Predictably, the sailors, several months later, upon their arrival back in Britain, had their prison sentences revoked and were with little fanfare quickly released from custody to make their way in life as they pleased. Despite forcefully challenging the British traders and officials' illicit activities, Lin sought to understand the British in ways that distinguished him from almost all other Chinese officials before him. Lin sought to learn as much about the foreign community as possible. Throughout his time in Guangzhou, Lin kept himself well informed about the tactics, methods, and stance of the British. From even before his arrival in Guangzhou in March of 1839, he had begun to assemble a team of translators to keep himself abreast of the larger debate swirling among the Euro-American community. Between July of 1839 and November of 1840, Lin's team translated over 170 excerpts, articles that touched on not just the situation in Guangzhou and trade, but kept Lin abreast of Queen Victoria's marriage, Britain's invasion of Afghanistan, and even the parliamentary debates back in London. His translators also carried out what we might call today opposition research. He acquired and translated relevant passages from books such as John F. Davis's The Chinese, A General Description of the Empire of China and its Inhabitants, or Charles T. Downing's The Fangui in China, Everyday Life in 19th Century China. It was from these translations that Lin also learned of the passionate anti-opium positions taken by Cambridge-educated clergyman Algernon Theowald's The Inequities of the Opium Trade in China. With these translations, with daily updates, summaries of foreign studies, and an array of other scholarly works, few individuals in China would have had a better grasp of the situation than Lin Zexu himself. My point in raising all of this is that in this manner we can see Lin's actions emerge not from poorly informed ignorance, Sinocentric cultural beliefs, but rather through analyzing hard data, reviewing English language publications, and engaging in ongoing conversations with foreigners in and around Guangzhou. In other words, Lin's attempts to find ways to circumvent Eliot and those traders whose livelihoods depended on the opium trade, including Lin's decision to write a letter to Queen Victoria herself, were far from delusional, misguided, or doomed to fail end runs. It's almost certain that no one knew this better than Charles Eliot and his patron, Lord Palmerston. Eliot's strong-arm tactics with Lin Zexu appear to have followed a well-worn strategy that Britain deployed around the world. These strategies were born out of Britain's cultural biases, political exigencies, and commercial advantages. However, these tactics were not uniformly approved by all British. When Eliot's pro-trade tactics became publicly known back in Britain in the spring of 1840, public opinion was surprisingly divided. Many pointed out that China's laws against illicit goods mirrored many of Britain's own efforts to suppress rampant smuggling along its own coast. Nor did all Britons accept Eliot's contention that ignorance of China's opium laws gave British traders the right to flaunt such regulations. Opinions were so divided and political fissures so deep that for 3 days in early April 1840, British politicians debated in the House of Commons what they called the China War for more than 17 hours over the course of 3 days. In this debate, Sir George Staunton, the same man who as an 11-year-old had sailed to China with the Macartney mission and indeed met and spoke to the Qianlong Emperor, insisted that, quote, with the respect to the immorality or impolicy of the opium trade, he yield to no member of the House in his anxiety to put it down altogether. The following day, William Gladstone, who would later serve as the Prime Minister, directly criticized the British government's role and neatly summarized those who opposed its tactics in China, saying, quote, I am not competent to judge how long this war may last or how protracted may it be in its operations, but this I can say, a war more unjust in its origin, a war more calculated in its progress to cover this country with permanent disgrace, I do not know and I have not read of. At the end of the third day, when the censure motion was put to a vote, it was defeated by a mere 9 votes, 262 to 271. With only this 9-vote margin, Britain continued down the path Charles Eliot had put it on, a military confrontation with China. As I had hinted to above, these debates were not unknown to Lin. He continued to read summaries of the parliamentary debates which were published in the Canton Press and the Chinese Repository, beginning in July, including the statements of Staunton and Gladstone that I have just read to you. The implications of the parliamentary debates were almost certainly understood by Lin. But with that parliamentary victory, the British government, echoing Eliot, now characterized Lin's enforcement as, quote, unjust, unlawful, confining of our innocent countrymen, and insulting the sovereign in the person of her representative. My point here is that to fault Lin for not anticipating British officials' complete misrepresentation of his actions and Britain's use of such mischaracterizations as a basis to build support for a British military response by the narrowest of margins is misplaced. From the moment Lin had been appointed, Lin fully appreciated the vast resources, both colonial and military, at Britain's disposal. Lin's miscalculation was not culturally based. His miscalculation was overlooking Britain's willingness to despite its ostensible liberal democratic system, to protect its opium trade with China by violent means. As Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Carolyn Evans, a scholar of British imperialism, has aptly described, this was a predisposition to legalized lawlessness, a process she characterized as legalized acts of coercion, suspension of due process. Regarding the events of 1840, Britain's leaders rejected out of hand the illegality of their production and trade of opium and instead, with parliamentary approval, declared war on China, based solely on their self-serving and spurious claim that China's glaring insults and grievous wrongs would degrade Britain in the eyes of the world if not acted upon. As we all know, Britain's navy was also the most powerful in the world at this point, and there was very little China could do, or any empire at that moment, when they deployed their navies to Guangzhou. When the British forces decided to move north, this is just one of the battles there that they used. Interesting kind of side comment. One of the first ironclad ships was actually put to use during the Opium Wars. So Britain was clearly deploying the most cutting-edge military technology available to the time. So it also inverts that whole notion that China was militarily backward. When the British forces decided to move north and threaten other Chinese ports, the Chinese emperor lost his confidence, and on October 20th, Lin learned of the decision by the emperor to remove him from office, demote him in rank, and eventually exile him to Xinjiang in the northwestern China. Lin's career, however, was not over. After his 3-year-long exile, Lin rose again to hold the top offices in the Chinese Empire. In the autumn of 1850, the young Xianfeng emperor again appointed Lin as imperial commissioner and asked him to go to Taiping to fight the Taiping rebels in Guangxi province to the west of Guangzhou. It was on the road to take up this post on November 22nd in 1850 that Lin Zexu died at the age of 65. Even if Lin had not fallen ill and died on his way to Guangxi, it is unlikely that he could have contained the powerful rebel uprising that would become known as the Taiping Rebellion. With an unanticipated degree of coordination and organization, the Taiping military forces routed the substantially larger Qing army. Buoyed by a host of popular policies, implementing surprisingly effective military tactics, the Taipings launched a 14-year-long civil war fighting for the hearts and minds of China. Until its fall in 1864, Taiping officials and armies controlled large swaths of central China. You can see here on the map, from Wuchang in the west to the outskirts of Shanghai in the east. With the central court distracted, preoccupied, and threatened by the greatest challenge to their political rule in 2 centuries, numerous other insurrections also erupted. The Qing found itself fighting for its political life. The mid-19th century uprisings between 1850 and the mid-1870s ravaged, overwhelmed, and pushed the central government to the brink of collapse. By the time imperial armies finally defeated the last rebel forces, as many as 50 million Chinese had lost their lives, with the Taiping Rebellion alone responsible for more than 20 million deaths. And yet, my point here is that the Qing dynasty had endured. Given the sheer scale of the rebellions and the open antipathy towards the Manchu rule, the Qing's ability to not just parry such attacks, but vanquish them was a stunning testament to the dynasty's political and military vitality. Impressively, as part of this success, their success was a result of the top-to-bottom reorganization. The Qing's fiscal, military, and institutional structures emerged stronger than ever. I raise this because it's a rarely acknowledged fact that the Western imperialism's ability to extract increasingly harsh concessions from Qing China in the second half of the 19th century occurred primarily as a consequence of not as a generalized decline of the Qing court, but rather as a result of the fact that the Qing court was forced to prioritize internal suppression efforts over combating foreign aggression. Nor is this correlation between internal disorder and the increase in foreign encroachment a mere coincidence. Britain and other European powers deliberately exploited China's domestic turmoil to advance their own political and commercial interests. Throughout the 1850s and 1860s, opium imports, still illegal, continued to flow into China. With India still producing the bulk of the imported opium, Britain garnered ever higher profits. Still, the British remained unsatisfied, resentful, and disgruntled. British consuls, missionaries, and traders found it galling that their hard-won concessions from the Treaty of Nanjing at the end of the Opium War had not led to more commensurate increase in the acceptance of British culture, interest in foreign religion, or demand for Western products. Confident, once again, that the problem lay with the Chinese rather than themselves, the British accused the Chinese government of being obstructionist and anti-free trade. With the Qing court fighting for its political survival, the British returned once again to a strategy of violence and extortion. On the morning of October 8, 1856, 6 years after Lin's death, Harry Parkes, the newly arrived British consul to Guangzhou, transformed a routine detention into an international incident. Parkes had learned Chinese officials had boarded and seized a cargo ship, Arrow, and detained most of its crew. Wasting little time, he insisted the vessel in question was British, sailing under a British flag, and thus the sailors protected by British laws. Parkes accused the Chinese of deliberately depriving Britain of their treaty rights and lodged a formal protest. In fact, it was Parkes, not the Chinese, who were failing to adhere to international maritime laws. Responding to each and every charge, Qing officials established beyond any doubt that the ship had been built in China, owned by a Chinese subject, and manned by a Chinese crew sailing in Chinese waters. Virtually all of Parkes' claims came to be called into question, not just by Chinese officials, but also his supervisors, military officials, and many members of the home government, who would all come to rue their support of Parkes' earliest allegations. Like Charles Eliot and many British officers before him, Parkes refused to let specious assertions get in the way of his desired outcomes. Following his familiar script, the British consul insisted to the British plenipotentiary John Bowring that China's counterclaims were tantamount to an attack on the British flag, honor, and empire. Bowring and the British ranking naval officials in China agreed these were insults that demanded a full military response. Within little more than a week's time, Parkes had taken a questionable infraction and step by step brought Great Britain into a state of undeclared war with China. Popular opinion back in Britain once again was divided. Like in the original Opium War, many in Britain's parliament also took issue with Harry Parkes' assertions, methods, and long-term implications on Britain's foreign policies. In late February 1857, a motion was put before the House of Commons, insisting no evidence had been presented to establish satisfactory grounds for the violent measures resorted to at Guangzhou in the late affair of the Arrow. This time, the debate lasted for more than 4 days, and when a vote was finally called, it passed by a healthy 14-vote margin of 263 to 249. Lord Palmerston, now Prime Minister, and who had led the pro-Wing party as Foreign Secretary during the First Opium War, accused the opposition of being unpatriotic, dissolved the government, and called for a snap general election. With the China War and hostilities playing a central role in the election, Lord Palmerston's Whig Party won an astounding 64% of the vote and added an additional 53 seats to their majority. Britain had once again put the unambiguous details of the original incident to one side and instead justified their military response on the principle of national honor. Initially, it all seemed that once again, Britain's military would be allowed to bully China into obedience. With the Qing resources almost entirely diverted towards fending off the mounting Taiping advances, the British officials made quick diplomatic work of the Treaty of Tianjin, being provisionally agreed to in 1858. However, the following year, when the British representatives returned with the ratified treaty, the Xianfeng Emperor and his advisors bristled at Britain's insistence that their warships should be allowed into Tianjin Harbor and their troops allowed to proceed with their representative to Beijing. The British, unwilling to accept such a diplomatic reversal, made the decision to force their way past the Qing defenses. The Dagukou forts, situated along the Hai River estuary, guarded the river approach to Tianjin and thus the overland route to Beijing. Their positioning offered the Chinese several strategic advantages. The multiple forts were surrounded by massive mudflats, making both naval and land approaches treacherous. In addition, the Qing general who ruled these forts anticipated the British desire to resort to military rather than diplomatic methods, and had constructed multiple lines of defenses. These defensive measures did little to slacken British confidence. So it came as quite a shock to the British when, over the course of 2 days from June 25th to 26th, out of the some 1,300 troops, more than 500 British Marines, soldiers, and sailors were killed or wounded. 29 of them were officers, including a rear admiral and 2 captains. It was a surprising and stunning Chinese victory. As one witness noticed, the defeat was the most serious which the English have experienced in Asia since the march out of Kabul in 1842. Unlike that defeat, where the largest number of deaths came of the winter retreat over the Khyber Pass, this loss was entirely due to Chinese superior tactics and strategy. In the eyes of the British and Lord Palmerston, such a humiliating defeat demanded a forceful and unforgettable response. Thus it was the following summer the British returned with a massive military force that totaled more than 10,000 infantry, marines, and cavalry, supported by another 6,000 French troops. Careful, methodical, and with overwhelming numerical superiority, the British and French forces had by August 1860 captured Dagukou forts and began to make their way overland from Tianjin to Beijing. By early October, the French and British forces approached the Qing capital, encircled the city, and eventually occupied the city and its surrounding areas. Outraged at the death and treatment of British and French prisoners by the Chinese, and believing that the Qing court needed to be taught one more lesson, on October 18th, Lord Elgin ordered the Yuan, the summer palace, burned to the ground. Demonstrating both the degree to which they wished to complete the job and the sheer scale of the Yuan, which was massive, the razing of the palace required 4,000 British troops, and the ensuing blaze lasted 3 days. It was an inordinately disproportionate conclusion to a chain of events that had begun with the minor incident reported by Harry Parkes almost exactly 4 years earlier. But with few options, again, beset by internal rebellions and their capital invaded at gunpoint by foreign armies, the Qing court hastily assented and finally ratified the Treaty of Tianjin. With the ratification of these agreements, so ended what many have called the Second Opium War. In adopting this name, a tragic series of deeds across 2 decades were instantly linked back to Lin Zexu's seizure of opium in 1839. Yet such logic, while seductive in its simplicity, does little to acknowledge that the First and Second Opium Wars were linked primarily not by Chinese intransigence, but by British truculence. To this day, there remains a stubborn refusal to place the bulk of the responsibility for the Opium Wars on the British and their brash attempts to keep the opium trade in place. Instead, most accounts retain a tenacious insistence that China's misplaced attempts to end the trade brought the war upon themselves. In this manner, Lin's decision to destroy 3 million pounds of opium is persistently characterized as emerging out of his deep ignorance of the world around him, rather than his and China's unmistakable growing awareness of that world. Lin's actions were not unenlightened, they were not misplaced, or made without an appreciation of Britain's global standing, military power, and international commercial interests. His career-crowning role as Imperial Commissioner reveals a clear-eyed attempt to end the decades-long British production, conveyance, and distribution of illicit product to China. His remanding of traders in their own factories, his destruction of the opium, and his effort to enforce China's laws within its own realm remained entirely within Chinese and international legal guidelines of the era. To cast Britain's forcible pursuit of concessions from China at each turn consistently based on contrived and spurious evidence as being somehow due to anything else than Lin's morally upright and legally defensible right to terminate the opium trade is both perverse and twisted. It represents a deeply ingrained and long-repeated acceptance of Britain's legalized lawlessness. Only when one sheds this self-serving mythology of Britain's past, a mythology in which Britain's actions are, despite all evidence to the contrary, cast as invariably just, legitimate, and morally righteous, can one see Lin Zexu's actions, career, and legacy for what they were. A man self-assured in his own knowledge to seek out new ways of seeing the world. An official whose tenacious pursuit of justice shaped an empire. And a patriot who relentlessly upheld the sovereign rights of the Qing Empire as it emerged onto the world arena. Seen in this light, then, perhaps it is more accurate to remember Lin merely as a child of empire, an official of China, and a pathfinder in a globalizing world. Thank you all very much.
Working microphone.
Okay.
So here we go. So let me give you the microphone.
Okay.
Right. So we have time for questions for about 20 or 25 minutes. Perhaps I'll just begin by asking you one small question, and then we can move forward. Now, the Taiping Rebellion, of course, had to do with the fact of the leader having been influenced by American missionary activity.
Correct.
Right? That he had a peculiar understanding of Christianity and saw himself as Jesus' brother and God's Chinese son. So is there a sense in which there was some larger Chinese suspicion of Western cultural influence beyond the question merely of the opium itself, and particularly because, after all, the Chinese were also in communication with the Japanese, who had a long tradition of suspicion with regard to Western cultural influence.
No, I mean, that's a great point. I mean, I think the Taiping Rebellion, in fact, the other rebellions that were going on, the Panther Rebellion that was the topic of my first book, and then the Muslim Rebellion in the Northwest, they all, there was lots of connections between China and the West. And that was one of the things I was trying to emphasize with Lin's translation efforts. There was no linkage that implicitly, just because the opium trade was British, that all things British or Western were bad. And I think that really, it typifies that time period in general, and that definitely by the time of the Taiping Rebellion, we can see that the ideas that Hong Xiuquan, the leader of the Taipings, the Christian ideas that he took, they were completely twisted and converted and perverted. But again, they believed that it was Christianity. So it's one of the earliest seeds I think we see where China is interested in the world around it. And again, that's why I started the talk off going all the way back to the McCartney mission. I mean, I didn't have time tonight to talk about it, but the Jesuit presence in the Qing court, was pervasive. And there was a large awareness and acceptance of the West. We go back, if you want to go back even further, you can go back to the Kangxi and the efforts to, embrace Catholicism widely in China. It wasn't China that broke off the ties. The rights controversy was it was Rome, so it was the opposite way. So,
Right. So, will you just wait for the microphone, please? Yeah.
Thank you. That's a really fascinating talk. Enjoyed it very much. I just wonder whether there's one dimension that doesn't figure very much in your story, actually should come into this account, and that is the enormous interest of Indian private businesses had in opium to start with, and Chinese merchants also, who had an interest in the opium trade. I mean, they virtually they ran the trade. The state had an interest in, as you said, balance of payments or taxation, but they wouldn't be anywhere without the private merchants' interest, commercial interest. So when, I wonder whether this aggression in the British account of things came partly from, I mean, there are of course cultural biases, but there may also be a confidence in the knowledge that they're representing a private interest, which is, when they talk about imperial subjects, they're probably referring to Bombay's merchants.
yeah, no, I mean, it is a fascinating dimension that I kind of had to limit out and pull that dimension out. But the private merchants were some of the most wealthiest people in the world, right? I mean, we know that converted to today's currency, they were billionaires. And Lin actually targeted them as well, right? And so he understood that there was a complicity. He called them traders. He called them collaborators. So he understood the complicit kind of interaction between them as well. And again, that's what I think is interesting, is that he wasn't trying to end trade, which there are some critiques that suggest, there's the Confucianism's anti-commercial attitudes. But we don't see that in Lin's actions, actually. Again, he's laser focused on just the opium. Now, obviously, many of us then can connect those dots and suggest that, by that fact alone. But what's interesting, if you reel back again, and I took this out actually just when I was revising the talk today, is that when McCartney traveled to China in 1792, he met with one of the British East India Company's shareholders, and they explicitly said if the emperor brings up opium, to allow it to be removed. But between that date and 1839, that's when it just became inconceivable for the British merchants or the British East India Company to release it.
Thank you, Professor Atwill, for your presentation. I just had some observations to make. I'm interested in Himalayan histories, and I'm currently working on it. So through my research, what I've discovered is that the British were initially more focused on using the Himalayas as an way of reaching China. So even before opium, they were thinking of exchanging Himalayan products from Tibet in order to balance the trade deficit with China. So that is an interesting story which, apart from people like Alistair Lamb, I have not seen many people explore that angle.
Yeah, could you focus on a question?
Yes. So my question here is that for the failure of the McCartney mission, do you think that the invasion of Nepal, which was made by China in 1793, which was tied to the larger Himalayan geopolitics, did it have a role to play in Chinese suspicions? Because the Chinese were also aware that the British had created a huge empire in India.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, that was another incident that I just kind of pushed to the side. That surprised McCartney, actually, that the Chinese understood and knew of the connection between the Gorkha War and the British support, or suspicions of British support behind that. And so the first thing is that they accused McCartney and British of supporting that. McCartney denied all British support. The irony here is that there's no way McCartney could have known or not known whether the British were involved, because he had sailed from Britain and was not involved in British India at that point in time. But just the fact that the Qianlong Emperor understood and the Qing officials had made those linkages, I think, goes to your point, that the Qing Empire was aware of precisely what the British were up to. after McCartney denied the claims, they flipped it on him and said, well, will you support us in suppressing the Gorkha War, which he also denied doing, or gracefully declined the option of doing those. So I think, yeah, the Himalayans play into this element, but I don't think there's any question that the percentage of trade from maritime Asia was, dwarfed that going over the Himalayas mountains.
Thank you so much for the informative session, Dr. Atwill. I wanted to ask, because the McCartney mission was the second diplomatic mission that Britain had sent. It was followed by the 1816 mission led by Lord Amherst, which was even more of a conflict because they stayed at the Yuanming Yuan Palace, and they had refused the emperor's invitation because he wanted to rest. How much of the attitude of Lord Amherst and his colleagues was based on what McCartney had spread, and how much did it sour the Anglo-Chinese relations?
I think that's the very standard interpretation, is that we kind of see a growing distrust of it. But if I was to have included that in tonight's talk, what I would have emphasized is that once again, that interpretation disregards that the Chinese understood exactly what the end game was of the British. And by the time of the Amherst mission, they were even more distrustful of what the British were up to. So
the Qianlong Emperor's successor, I remember.
Yeah, Jia Qing, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
As you mentioned, Taiping Rebellion and then again White Lotus Rebellion against Qing Dynasty. Professor, my question is that how do you see centuries of humiliation that British have perpetrated against, and my question is that, is it myth and what's your take on this, the term the British and other historians use, centuries of humiliation? So I just wanted to know your views on this.
Centuries of what?
Centuries of humiliation.
Centuries of humiliation.
Oh, humiliation. Centuries of humiliation. I think that raises a really good historiographical issue, because what's going on here is that part of the reason this narrative of Asia's or China's past has adopted this kind of Anglophone, British-centric perspective is that because it serves a very useful part for the Chinese government today as well, which is that the Qing government is a feudal institution that is, suppressing its people and allowing them to become opium addicts. And thus the term, a century of China's humiliation allows that, because it's a very neatly, almost, exactly a century before the rise of the communist government. So I think it's a very useful term. Do I think it's very accurate? Not really, because I think that's what the end point there I was trying to display was that my view is that a government that's able to suppress those many mid-19th century rebellions is not one that's in inherent decline. And that the ways that they were able to overcome and suppress those rebellions suggest that there's a vitality there that continued on for several more decades.
The burning of the Summer Palace, it happens immediately after the Indian Rebellion of 1857 is suppressed. So my question to you is, had that not happened, it's an if question, which is a difficult question, because the build-up of the military machine, which would have required the suppression of the Indian Rebellion, would have, to demobilize them would have taken some more time, fiscally and trained personnel-wise. So had that not happened, do you still foresee something as drastic would have happened?
Sorry, if I may just add, Indian troops were involved in
That's
this.
correct, yeah. No, it's an interesting question. I'll just invert it, and what I can say more historically, factually, is that the British troops and the Indian troops that were there with them were using tactics that that they imported and came with them. James Hevia's book, just the division of all the loot, and division of the spoils, the ways that they carried out the trials. It was all learned from the aftermath of the suppression of events in India. So I think there's so the question would be that could the second one occur if the first one didn't? Probably, but
I think there's an essay by Anand Yang where he talks about a person who actually participated.
That's right.
And wrote a memoir about it, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, it's very interesting, again, why I'm delighted to be here. There's these interesting connections that it's a sign, I think, it's a sad sign of the division of Aryan studies, that we don't really do more comparative work. In writing the book that I've just completed, a lot of times I had to excise the parts, because I took these kind of side trips into Indian history, but one of the things I learned in my last book about writing about Tibetan Muslims is that it was actually much better received by South Asians and Tibetologists than Sinologists. It's just that Sinologists were actually very conservative and were very Sinocentric in our interpretation, so it's too bad. 'Cause I mean, and so one of my goals is actually to kind of follow up and write a few articles about these interesting tangential connections.
We can still take a couple of questions. Yeah, back there. Can you just hang on for a mic?
You used a very interesting word. You described Commissioner Lin as a patriot. So there's a lot of discussion now about an old patriotism which comes from, say, service classes of the Mughal Empire, etc. So what normatively did he think he was defending?
I mean, I think he was defending the empire. I mean, I think he very much, you know, when you write a biography, which is what the book is really about, is you have to reflect on the person and how they perceive themselves. And I think he was very much an imperial servant. I think he felt himself to be very much serving at the service and pleasure of the emperor. And so I use that word patriot in a much more of a 19th century, you know, servant of the empire, believer in the goals of it. But one of the things that I spent time reflecting on was, I think it was Spence who used the phrase that when because he and the Daoguang Emperor were both born at the end of the Qianlong Emperor's life. And so I think when you're coming of age and you're seeing the decline, where you were born at the peak of an empire, but your lifetime you're seeing that decline take a pace around you, that was very much formed, both him and the Daoguang Emperor's vision of the world. And so in Lin's case, though, I think that really shaped that he wanted to promote and uphold as much as he could China's interests domestically, but also internationally.
If I may just make a remark, of course, there is still the question, for instance, of, some residual Ming loyalism which remains, and where the Qing are actually still the foreigners. So, I mean, that complicates the question of patriotism a little bit, because you could be a patriot and anti-Manchu or anti-Qing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, interesting, Lin was among the select few who, after he passed the highest exam, was sent to a ministry where he learned the Manchu language. And so, again, I think when you're an official of that height, you have to identify with the Manchu themselves. So you're right. I think it's probably, there's a tinge of that element. I mean, Toby Meyer Fong, yeah. Her book, she talks about these complex loyalties and the way that ethnicity plays into them. But for officials, I think if I call Lin a patriot, I'm almost positive that he would have identified with the Manchu regime itself.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask Professor Atwill about the three vendors from India, vendors from China, and the East India Company traders. What is that deep requirement of the tea that made them to go for wars from the side of England? Can you just tell us?
Say again?
Why were the English driven to war as opposed to other actors? Say something like that.
I mean, I think this is the question about the British in the 19th century, and I would say America today. I really can't describe the motivations for that. I think I framed it in my talk. I think most historians suggest that it was commercially driven, and this was a way to preserve. But at several points I highlight that this is dressed up as British patriotism, right, in the name of the flag, country, and ruler for them. And again, with modern, often I make the comparison, when we talk about Lin and why he made the decision, there's a lot of kind of what I would consider victim blaming. I think the same as the comparison I often see is with Russia invading Ukraine, right, is that we can't blame Ukraine for their actions when Russia is the one that's invading it. So what makes a nation invade or go to war and use their resources in that manner? It's a psychological question that I don't think I'm qualified to answer.
Okay, perhaps we can take a last question.
Yes, so my question is, you talked about how the West has looked at Chinese history, how Western historians have looked upon it. It tries to justify its actions against Imperial China. My question is, are there any convenient lies and inconvenient truths that the nationalist historians in China have spread to justify or to justify the communist uprising in China? As in...
Sorry, did you say the communist uprising in China?
What I mean to say, just to spread propaganda the way Mao Zedong was spreading in the 1940s. So are there any...
tangent, isn't it?
Yeah, no.
Yeah. I mean, but perhaps you could just address once more the question of the way in which modern Chinese historiography comes back to this question of opium wars and its portrayal.
Yeah, I mean, because again, I think I'm trying to remember who started off. Maybe it was James Hevia's book too. Or maybe it was Julia Lovell. I can't remember now. But the start of the book and the power, the symbolism that the burning of the Yuan Summer Palace remains extremely visceral today, right? And going back to the question of a century of humiliation, this is something that has been maintained and developed and I would say cultivated by the Chinese government today. And so if you're talking about kind of inconvenient truths, these are very powerful tropes that the government wants to keep alive, right? They're less interested in, I would say, it'll be a test to see if my first two books weren't translated into Chinese. We'll see if this one can get translated into Chinese. But I think it's much more in line with the Chinese government's the goals. But the century of humiliation and the burning of the Yuan Palace, well, it's part of primary school education, that part. But I think there is finally a willingness to begin to learn, again, because of what China's position is today, to take a harsher look at what Western imperialism is doing to China and looking for those parallels from the 19th century into the 21st century.
Okay, so thank you very much for your talk. I think that a lot of us thought we knew something about the Opium War and discovered that we didn't actually know as much as we should have. So thank you very much again, thank you all for the discussion.